You're listening to Scalay Sisters, episode number 77. Welcome to Scalay Sisters, the podcast for the classical homeschooling mama who seeks to learn and grow while she's helping her children learn and grow. Scalay Sisters is a casual conversation about topics that matter to those of us in the trenches of classical homeschooling who yearn for something more than just checking boxes and getting it all done. I'm your host, Brandy Wenzel. You can find me over at afterthoughtsblog.net, spreading my Charlotte Mason joy through blog posts, study guides, audios, and more. My co-hosts today are Pam Barnhill, Mystie Winkler, and Abby Wall. Pam is a speaker, podcaster, blogger at pambarnhill.com, and author of two fabulous books, Better Together and Plan Your Year. Mystie is a second-generation homeschooler with 5 kids and too many projects. With her blog, podcast, and membership, she helps you organize your attitude so you can organize your life. Find her over at simplyconvivial.com. As Mystie recently left Instagram, this podcast is one of the only public places she can still be found. Abby is basically the queen of the Scalay Sisters sistership. Abby is a country-living farmer, rancher, a loving wife, and mom of 5 who homeschools and reads whenever she can. Registration is now open for this year's online local retreats, which is coming up on Saturday, October 10th. The theme of this year's retreat is Loving Well, and our guest speaker is Karen Glass. This is going to be a wonderful time in which we deeply explore the topic of love as it relates to homeschooling, mothering, and continuing our own educations. Go to scalaysisters.com/love to register. Today's discussion centers on the differences between communities and networks, as spelled out by John Taylor Gatto in his wonderful little book, Dumbing Us Down. We think you'll find a lot of food for thought in this episode, and so, without further ado, let's get to it. Let's start off with our Scalay Everyday. Who would like to go first?
I will. This is Abby.
Yay!
I am going to put in a plug for the Liberal Arts Tradition by Ravi Jain and Kevin Clark. We just happen to have started the book club inside Sistership, led by our one and only Mystie Winkler.
It's pretty much the only way they can contact Mystie now.
Yeah.
You must join Scalay Sisters if you want to talk to Mystie.
Right.
Our walled princess.
Yes, where she is giving us questions and writing up lovely summaries and narrating. So I am really looking forward to a Zoom chat that will be happening next week on the first chapter or the introduction. So I am enjoying that book, and there's a lot of things to talk about and a lot of footnotes in that book to talk about. In fact, some of the pages have more footnotes than actual writing on the pages.
I was just going to say that.
Yes.
That's my memory of that one, is that sometimes there are way more footnotes than there is actual content.
I feel like a fun project would actually be to try to go through and read all the things they're referencing in the footnotes.
That would be a huge project.
I just read the footnotes, and I feel that that's sufficient for right now.
I agree.
Because he also quotes John Calvin's Institutes and, in lots of different things. And as far as I know, Mystie and her family are still working on that one.
That's a 2-year project.
Yeah.
Yeah, just read all of Aristotle, all of Plato, all of...
See what I'm saying? It could be a really good project.
Yes.
Well, that's no doubt. No doubt it would be.
So, Abby, did you read the first edition?
I have it, and it's much smaller, and I started reading it, but then they said they were getting a new one, or they were coming out with the new one. So then I just promptly stopped and said, I probably don't need to read this if I'm just going to read the better and updated version. So
Okay. So I was going to ask you how you thought it compared, but if you haven't read them both.
Yeah. It's just significantly bigger. And my other one was a paperback and this one's a hardback. So I like a hardback.
Pretty, huh?
Yeah, it is.
I like
it's pretty nice.
All right. Let's go next.
I'll go next.
All right.
So I read Prisoners of Geography, 10 Maps That Explain Everything About the World by Tim Marshall. And I really, really, really like this book.
Ooh.
Yeah, it's like speaking my language because I could understand what was going on. So
I feel like I've heard good things about this lately.
Yeah, it was a good meaty book. And it's funny. So the kids and I were watching CNN 10 yesterday and they were talking all about the South China Sea. And I was like, oh, I know exactly what's going on there.
Let me educate you, children.
It was great. So my favorite chapter was Russia. That was a really good one. And then, of course, China. Oddly enough, I skipped over a lot of the Middle East. It was more of a snooze fest than I thought it was going to be, which I did not expect that. But it was just, I really, really enjoyed the book. It was really good. And then you get to the part, there's actually a place out there between India and Pakistan where the border is undecided. And
really?
Yeah. Or is it India and Pakistan or is it India and somewhere else? Maybe India and China. We were talking about it. My husband's like, yeah, if you go to Google Maps, like there's nothing there because they don't.
Wow.
Yeah. So anyway, it was cool. It was my kind of book. I love these nonfiction kind of informational books, and it was written really well. It was just good. I enjoyed it. I highly recommend.
Very cool. Miss, do you want to go or you want me to go?
Okay, well, I will go. I will follow up on the Russia comment because I am reading Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky, which I'm probably not saying it right, but it's kind of fun to say. And so I have like a tale of woe or shame or something about this book because I listened to it on audio several years ago. And something, I must have missed like half an hour at some point or something along the way, because when it got to the last chapter and everything was wrapping up, I had totally missed something along the way because it made no sense at all to me. Like there were even characters that came back in that last section and I had no clue who they were. So I guess I zoned out from some of it while listening.
That's hilarious.
But the parts that I was paying attention to, I loved. So I started it again after that, and that's been a couple of years now. And I only got about a third of the way through before I dropped off, and that was with another online. That was a group on the AO forums. We're reading it. I thought, I'll do that, and I did for about 1/3 of the book. And now I'm trying again because Lisa Amer is reading it with a group inside Sistership, in the Sistership Book Club's group. And so we've had our little workshop about Russian literature. That was great and very helpful. And I only watched half, but I have the rest to watch of a workshop on Russian history from Professor Carroll that she did.
Oh,
yep.
And I think that it will make a lot more sense this time.
Cool.
That's my hope.
So, Mystie, are you reading it or are you going to listen to the audio again this year?
I am reading it this time.
Okay.
Yeah.
And do you have the Pivar translation?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So that's what I'm actually thinking about it because I do have an audio of it, but it's not the recommended translation and they don't have that one.
On audio. No.
Well, they have an abridged, but it's like 6 hours. I was like, that can't be a Russian novel. That's like a Russian short story. And then I realized, oh no, it's abridged. That makes more sense.
I haven't compared them closely, but I just went ahead with the translator that
Nicholas, right?
Yeah. Kotar.
Yeah.
Nicholas Kotar, who taught our workshop, recommended.
He says that's the only people to get.
He does.
So.
He was very insistent that the lady that translated the audio version that I listened to was no good.
Really?
She doesn't even like Russians, is what he said.
Oh, I will join that club.
Well, now I'm going to have to go through and see what I have a collection of basic Russian novels, but I have no idea who the translators are because I bought them all before I was really thinking that way about books. Like it never dawned on me to look at who the translator was 20 years ago when I bought these things. So, I need to go check them.
I just love, I've only read the first book, so the first few chapters, but he makes such great sweeping statement that he introduces these very particular idiosyncratic characters, but then makes general observations that are true of all humanity, and you recognize that as you read it. And that's what literature is really all about. So it's great.
Well, my School A Every Day is a book I had completely forgotten about, but I've been planning 10th grade the last few days and did finish yesterday, by the way. I'm in a bit of a homeschool planning coma right now, but
congratulations. Well done.
Thank you. That was the one grade I had left to do. And it was the hardest one because it was the one I was kind of doing from scratch. So her 10th grade year, my daughter, is sort of a combination of years 9 and 10 from AO, but not quite. But just because I had her in AO for groups, which takes years 7 and 8 and spreads them out over 3 years. So in 9th grade, she was still finishing year 8. So now I'm at this point where it's like she has 3 years left of high school and there's 4 years left of our curriculum. So I'm kind of having to like smush and make choices, that that kind of stuff. In the midst of this, I found a book that I had fallen in love with when my son did it 4 or 5 years ago, but I had completely forgotten about. And it's called John Hopkins' Notions on Political Economy. It's written by Jane Marcette. And I am kind of a junkie for economics books anyway, but this is like no economics book you ever read. So they're basically fairy tales that teach basic economic lessons.
Woo-hoo!
Like if you could take economics in one lesson and turn it into a series of fairy tales, I would say that a lot of what's in that book made it into this book. Of course, this book was written long before that because I think it was written in the 1800s, mid 1800s, I think. For example, there's one where this guy, so the main character's name is John Hopkins, and that's why it's named after him, John Hopkins Notions. So he has these ideas, right? And so like the very first chapter, he's complaining about rich people and, they've got all this stuff and he doesn't have anything. He's pretty sure it's all their fault. And wouldn't his life be so much better if those people would just, be whatever. And so this fairy appears and is like, I would love to help you. I could make that happen for you. So she waves a magic wand or whatever. And, the rich people become like other people. Well, it turns out that destroys the whole economy, right? Because the rich people were providing the jobs and all that kind of stuff. So it's kind of like his school of hard knocks because he goes to this fairy and asks for things and she gives him what he wants, but it never turns out the way he expects because his notions on political economy aren't actually worked out well in reality. So it is a fabulous book and it's so fun and it's very well written, but it's a completely different way of teaching economics. It really is. Anyway, I get to pull this back out and do this with my daughter, which I enjoyed doing with my son years ago. And I just can't wait. And I don't remember if it assigned the whole thing, but since I was doing my own schedule for all this, I made sure I assigned the whole thing. And I think it's going to be a total blast. She's reading it alongside, I think it's The Money Mystery by Richard Mayberry.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So I think the two of them should kind of complement each other a little bit. We'll see if I'm right.
I might be adding that one. We're doing Economics for Everyone, the DVD curriculum by R.C. Jr. But I thought that one looked really good, and I might just have to add this in.
I mean, I'll tell you, I don't do econ in circle time, but if I ever did, this would be my top pick for sure. Just because it's so unique and you can have really fun discussions about it, but it's not like dry, dull, like what you would expect from an economics book. So anyway, it's totally fun. Highly recommended. And with that said, let's transition to our topical discussion. Today, we're having a discussion about networks and communities. So what they are, how they're different, which we should strive for. And this is all based upon a chapter I'm getting my book out here, in John Taylor Gatto's book, Dumbing Us Down. And the chapter is called We Need Less School, Not More. So if anybody wants to read along, that is where you'll find most of these things. We're probably going to say page numbers, but I'll tell you right now, there's more than one version because Pam has different page numbers than I do. So with that said, I think we need to start off with just some basic definitions for these two concepts. So what's a network and what's a community has to be where we start before we start really digging into this. Anybody want to take a stab at either one of those?
Well, I think we do need to define those as he's using them. Like he's making a good distinction, but I don't know if necessarily it's what these words always mean every time they're used.
Oh, good point. Yeah.
But I thought he was making a good distinction and used good words to make that distinction.
So maybe my question should be, does anyone want to distill what he said they were?
So it seems like he's saying that a network is impersonal. Where you think of like a network, like a computer network, you're using a mechanistic metaphor for how humans are relating. Whereas a community is personal and human.
Yes.
Yeah.
I would agree with that.
Okay. So I was actually looking for a couple of things in the book. So it says a community is a place in which people face each other over time in all their human variety, good parts, bad parts, and all the rest. Such places promote the highest quality of life possible, lives of engagement and participation. So that's a community.
Yes. I liked his little thing, like a couple paragraphs over from that, or maybe just one. He says, a community will call its bums by their names. It makes a difference. And I thought, oh, so true, right? Like there's the people talk about the homeless, but then there's a small town not far from here where they really do know the names of all the guys on the streets.
Karate Dan. In my grandparents' town, it's a very, very small coastal town. That's Karate Dan, and he's well cared for.
Absolutely.
That's exactly what I thought of when they was
hilarious.
That.
I love it.
Yeah. Yeah.
He talked about vampire networks. He calls schools a vampire network. So he says a vampire network, like a school, which tears off huge chunks of time and energy needed for building community and family, and always asks for more.
Yes.
Needs to have a stake driven through its heart and be nailed into its coffin. Oh. So we have personal, impersonal, mechanistic, organic?
Fragmented. Networks, however, don't require the whole person, but only a narrow piece. And if you function in a network, it asks you to suppress all the parts of yourself except the network interest part. And it's highly unnatural. And then the fragmentation is caused by excessive networking, creates diminished humanity.
This was my Voldemort reference.
So you think he was networked into being evil?
Well, no, it's just an analogy.
I was just kidding.
He totally did it to himself. But you get that. I mean, that's when I was reading this. I was like, oh, it says you'll split yourself into many specialized pieces, none of them completely human. And I was like, oh, that's just like Voldemort. You've split yourself so much into all these little pieces that you almost don't have a soul anymore.
Wow, you're right. It really is like Voldemort.
I told you.
That's so good, Pam.
And that there's no time available to regenerate them.
Yeah. And it's all done for the sake of efficiency and getting a job done, accomplishing a goal as quickly as possible, because bringing whole selves and several whole selves to a situation is not ever going to be efficient. As every homeschool mom knows.
I'm trying to figure out, though, the tension of you don't want the whole self and it's about being efficient. But I feel like schools are extremely inefficient. That's why they're continually asking for, now they want 1 hour of homework. Now they want 2 hours of homework. And now they want this time and that. Like they're always demanding more of the students and of the parents and from the families. I really resonated with that vampire thing because I remember when little kids in our neighborhood start going to school, how it just eats up their whole life. How is that efficient?
Well, hold on, because he says in part 4, which I have parts in mind, but he says,
I do too.
Nearly a century ago, a French sociologist wrote that every institution's unstated first goal is to survive and grow, not to undertake the mission it has nominally staked out for itself. So once you set that network into place, it's no longer about accomplishing the goal that it's supposed to accomplish. It's about surviving and growing.
Yeah. And later in that part, it says, it was this Philistine potential that teaching the young for pay would inevitably expand into an institution for the protection of teachers, not students, that made Socrates condemn the sophists so strongly long ago in ancient Greece.
Well, and I've heard the pitch before for either public school or private school that, we need schools because of the efficiency factor. Isn't it better to send 10, 20 kids to one teacher than to have every mom be teaching kindergarten? It's supposed to scale better.
Yeah. Well, and it's because it's the industrial model, right?
Right.
Dewey's whole industrial model, it's supposed to be like a manufacturing, right? Everyone is the same age and they all go through and they're all the same, and uniformity and conformity are how they get the product.
It is true. There is an efficiency factor. I mean, that's why we start co-ops or take classes or whatever. So I think my question is it possible? Because you're right, Mystie. Private schools do this too. It's not like only public schools are the ones demanding more and more. I have a friend that has kids in private school, and it's constantly fundraising and this, that, and the other thing. And I think there is an efficiency too, that at the private school, well, you can just do, or even at the public school, you can just do sports there. You don't have to go somewhere separate for sports. I guess my question is it possible to create a school and have it not become a monster? Like, he seems to think it's in the nature of a school to do this. But do you think it's possible to have a learning group that is not vampiristic?
You just made that word up.
I totally did. And it works.
I like it.
You know what I'm saying? Like, isn't it possible for you to create something and have it just be what it is and not turn into this voracious monster that eats everything alive?
I didn't grab my liberal arts tradition book, but Peter Kreft in the foreword to it lists characteristics of real classical education and says that it's small and grassroots instead of institutional. And I think whenever bureaucracy takes over, then you get that kind of just self-perpetuating thing going. But if you have a band of moms getting together, I think you still have to guard against some of these temptations because they're just so ubiquitous in our culture. But it can be a community. It is possible to have a learning community.
So that's the difference, is that it would be a community. I think community necessarily has to be kind of small.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I like the word Mystie used, the grassroots. It needs to have that grassroots feel as opposed to kind of the top down.
Right. Parents are the enemy. Did you guys see that Twitter thing where there was like the teacher on Twitter talking about how it's going to be a problem because the parents are going to like hear what they're being taught at school and all that kind of stuff. And so the second you said just that animosity, where like, that's the complete opposite of grassroots. They're going to tell the kids what's best for them, and the parents really shouldn't be involved at all.
I didn't hear about this.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Ooh.
Well, actually, you will hear about some of it if you take the logic class from Monday.
Oh, okay. I'm a little bit behind. So that's this week's goal.
He read some of the tweets.
Okay.
In what is it? It's so for people who are doing this later, it would be in the week 6 class 1.
Okay.
Like he talked about that, how schools have an animosity toward parents.
And that's class 11.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. That's my goal this week, is to finish up, to be on time.
Which obviously not all teachers are that way, but he definitely was.
Yeah. But even John Taylor Gatto talks about that too. He says, no matter how good the individuals who manage an institution are, institutions lack a conscience because they measure by accounting methods.
I underlined that for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the things that we can guard against in our own communities. You know, are we seeing the actual people in their actual context? Or are we figuring out how we can most quickly and efficiently keep stats?
Yeah.
This kind of made me think, a couple of things. Brandy, of the whole Charlotte Mason warning against using it as a system as opposed to having a Charlotte Mason education based on principles, right?
Right. I even wonder if that's why it seems like when there are Charlotte Mason schools, and there's not that many, but they seem to always thrive as cottage schools. And I'm wondering if that's why. If it's because it would be much harder to have like a school district that was running on her philosophy versus, you know, a cottage school. I mean, usually the teachers have a lot of control and they're just they're not quite grassroots, but I think they're close. I always hesitate to say like big equals bad.
Yeah, but how many people do you know? I mean, in our area, even charter schools have wait lists, right? Like waiting lists to get in because they are smaller and they have more autonomy and they seem to involve parents more. We have some cousins who have their kids in a charter school and they're really happy with it. But it's smaller too, right? There's just not as many kids. It's just
a couple of my kids are in a charter school. And so we have a little bit of experience with that. And I will say, I still think that charter schools, I still think they fall into the definition of network and not community, though they may try pretty hard to have some of those things. I guess the main thing I was thinking about is how he was talking about, gosh, let me find that quote about, it was about this idea that where the institutions are created to serve, like they're created by the community to serve the community. Do you guys remember that quote?
Yeah, it's later on. I'm pretty sure.
I mean, he does say things like communities are collections of families and friends. There's complex relationships. And I don't want to say that doesn't happen in a charter school. And I think the in-person charter schools have more of an opportunity for that. Like virtual charter schools they're just virtual. they're not real. But I guess my thought is that there was this sense here where he was talking about how a school in the community sense was actually going to be created, or actually any institution in the community. Here we go. Okay. This is the beginning of part 2. In the growth of human society, families came first, communities second, and only much later came the institutions set up by the community to serve it. And I do think that's an important difference with, like, I'm thinking about how my church is trying to work on forming a school versus seeing charter schools. Charter schools are where a businessman, and I'm not saying they're bad, but where a businessman sees a potential market and creates something that he believes serves that market. I mean, there's a lot to be said for that, but I still see the difference between that and like what my church is trying to do, where you have an actual community that's been together for a long time, trying to set up an institution that will better serve it. I do see a difference where it's like the community setting something up that it believes will serve itself versus the charter school is setting up something where it believes it can serve customers. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, it makes total sense. And this goes back to the beginnings of the town schools in the United States. It was the town that got together and decided that they were going to form a school for the kids to go to and hire a teacher, but it was all very locally controlled and locally run. And it was part of the community, not something, it was the heart of the community and not something that pulled the community apart. The families and the community still came first.
Right. Yeah. And now you have the families not considered at all, really. Even by the good schools, they have policies and they'll try to work with you. But the idea that the family could trump, well, now even some of those policies are enshrined in law. So you don't even have the right to.
Right.
I don't even know what you do at this point. Everything's
other than opt out.
Right. Well, exactly. And I think that's what people are finding right now, especially in super tyrannical states like where I am. The school's not going to work with them. and the school's not going to have any sympathy for them. And I think they're realizing that they need to leave. I think it's a rude awakening for some people. There are people who, worked really hard to get into certain schools, and then now they're being disenchanted. The modern premise is that networks are workable substitutes for families, he says. But he says, that it's impersonal and it only wants a part of you. Can someone try to flesh out a little bit more about what he means by it only wants a part of you?
Well, if you think about your work network, really, though, they might give lip service or something to it or provide some kind of brief family leave, but really they're not. A lot of places where people work are not really concerned about their family. They just want the part of that person that can come in and do the job that they've been given.
I've even heard people wish that they could fire someone whose personal life got difficult.
Right.
Because it interfered with the work. It was an inconvenience to everybody else at the work.
Right. Whereas if this were a community, I mean, think about your church instead. It's more about reaching out and helping people who are having problems at home, not asking them to leave that at home. And I think some people would say, yeah, but that's a job. And but still, I think you could have a community atmosphere. I'm trying to think of a good example.
Simon Sinek has a few of those, actually. He actually talks a lot to business leaders about coming in and talking to the employees, especially the millennials, because they don't feel so connected and they want to make a difference, right? There's this whole idea that they switch jobs so much because they don't, within 6 months, they're not happy that they haven't changed the world yet. And he's trying to advise both of these parties, like the older generation and the younger generation, about this. It really does take time. And this younger generation needs to feel this sense of community because they were oftentimes at school all day, in sports or latchkey kids. And there's this whole generation of, hyper connectedness. And even in John Taylor Gatto's, he talks about networks make people lonely. I think that is something that is so true. Even with all of our ability to connect online now, it can still feel very isolating.
Or you think about a photography club or people you work out with at the gym. It's around that one particular thing. And if other aspects of your life come in, that's incidental, and people try to pretend they care, but people don't care. And you don't care about that. It's not relevant to why you actually got together.
Yep. When my husband has worked places that started to get all like, let's build community, I was always really on my guard because what that usually meant was, let's take you away from your family even more because you are a part of the community, but your family's not. You're the employee, and who cares about the other 5 people that live in your house? I would rather my husband not work somewhere that was community oriented.
There are probably small businesses that are community oriented,
Yeah.
And do bring in the whole family. We're, not saying that that's not out there.
Right. When you think about that kind of thing, you're probably thinking of the business actually having a place inside of a larger community, like in a small town. Or in a neighborhood, like where it's your local whatever, it's easier to connect all those things together because actually even the business isn't isolated. It's functioning as part of a larger interconnected whole.
Yeah. Well, think about us. I mean, the 3 of us, and then Abby came along a little bit later, but the 3 of us started working together, back in 2014?
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Like networking together back in 2014. We knew each other. We had a common interest, and we got together and we talked about that common interest. But I would say, probably for the first couple of years that we were a network.
For sure. Yeah.
And then as we've evolved in a community.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting about that is I wasn't really feeling it in that way until we saw each other in person. And I think that's an interesting part about community, the necessity of the in-person. I don't know. I mean, do you think you can have community with people you've literally never met in person? I've wondered that.
Well, I think, he says a community is a place in which people face each other over time in all their human variety, good parts, bad parts, and all the rest.
I think there is a difference in that if something happens in any of our lives, we aren't the ones, within our like School Sisters little group that we would call up probably because like I can't take you guys a meal. I can't watch your kids.
Mm-hmm.
That's true. I would pray for you, but I probably couldn't provide you much tangible help.
And we don't even really know all of the surrounding elements of our lives, each other's lives. Not in the way, like, I think it's this kind of community should be what our church community is, that extension of family where they see what's going on. So if you're talking about one part of your life together, they actually have the whole context of what's going on in the town, in just a bigger picture, and how this current situation is not isolated, but part of a bigger context. And like, I've met Abby's kids, but I haven't met any of your other kids. And I think that also is a part of that community context that does build a relationship and build community in a different way.
Maybe the important distinction is that you can have a real friendship with people that you don't see face to face. I mean, there's long histories of letter writing friendships and, that kind of stuff, but it's not the same thing as having a community.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Maybe that's the distinction.
Yeah.
Because I don't want to say these things aren't real.
Right. And when you do meet them in person, like I got to meet Renee recently in person, and we've talked a few times, quite a few times, but it's that, I guess that incarnate, it's like the real person, being able to give them a hug, even though you're not supposed to in COVID, but I still did.
Boo. Do it anyway.
Yeah. I did it anyway.
Down with hugs.
Yeah. But it does, it's just being able to see them in the flesh, right? And it deepens that even more. I mean, and I do think it's great that we can see our friends' pictures and their kids, and they can tell us about them, and they become, the interesting stories that we talk about, they become alive, and when we can see their kids' face. So, I mean, it's not unreal. It's, but I think it is a friendship rather than a community. I don't think you have to have friends it's nice if you have friends in your community, but that's not necessarily a requirement to be in a community.
No, that's interesting.
Okay.
Yeah.
You'll have to explain that. I think I may agree with you, but go on.
I mean,
tell us more about that.
We all are members of a church, and there are people that we gravitate towards, and there are other people who, are the interesting characters that maybe we wouldn't, strike up a conversation with every time. But if those people needed our help, we would take them a meal. We will be praying for them. Maybe their personality isn't such that it would, or we don't have a lot of things in common, but we have in common that we are members of the body of Christ. And therefore we are united, and we are part of a church community, the church. But I don't necessarily think that it means we have to be friends with them.
Yeah. I feel like in a lot of ways, you guys know me better than a lot of people who are in my real community. Even though you've never met my children and they have met my children, you probably know more about my children than they do.
Yeah.
We have the dirt on Pam's kids.
And I have actually provided meals for people who actually, one person I've never met before, they had a tragedy in their life. This was a number of years ago. And I actually had a local friend who also knew this person, a friend who was local to this person. And so we got together, and I sent money, and the friend took the food, So I don't know. And maybe it's just me and my personality, but I feel like you can have community with people who aren't actually in your community.
Is this about the hugs, Pam?
It has nothing to do with the hugs.
So I think this is where the four loves can come in and help with the distinctions.
Okay.
Because while I was reading the community part of dumbing us down, I was like, now, is he contradicting what Lewis was saying about friendship and clubs? Because so in Four Loves, C.S. Lewis is talking about clubs, and that's really what Gatto is saying, calling networks, where it's people coming together for this particular activity, and it's just a small slice of life that you're joining around and that you can talk shop about, or that you provide whatever need in this small slice of life. And I was like, I thought I remembered Lewis not thinking that was a bad thing. And I think that club and network, Gatto and Lewis are talking about the same thing. And Gatto is saying that this network aspect has become primary and has displaced friendship and community. And Lewis says that we need to band together. You know, he uses the hunter-gatherer metaphor where you need people to talk shop about your hobbies or your work or whatever. And it's okay to gather and talk shop, but that's not actually friendship. And so Lewis distinguishes between a club, what is you're side by side doing something together, and it's about the activity. And so if you're separated from these people for a certain amount of time and you come back together, you find there really isn't anything in common or a relationship or a friendship there. And that seems weird. But he says it's not, because the fun that you were having together was actually just about the doing the thing. And he says, but friendship forms out of that. Like our relationships often start there with those relationships, and then we find friends. And the difference in Four Loves is that a friendship is around an idea, and the club was about an activity. But I think what Gatto is talking about a community, he's not talking about friendship. He's really talking about family, and then extends it to community. You can't have a virtual family. You can have a virtual friendship where what draws you together and connects you and helps you is the idea. But you can't have a family around that.
The other thing that I was thinking about, Mystie, that maybe will kind of help clarify this was from Hannah Coulter, where she talked about, what did she call it? I meant to look it up.
The membership?
Was it the membership?
That is a Wendell Berry thing.
Yeah. And so that whole idea that you had everyone who was these families that kind of banded together and made their own community, this membership. And one of the interesting things, Gatto goes on to talk about education a little bit more, that the kids who were educated in the membership were the ones who stayed home and remained part of that community, whereas the kids where the network was prized, then those were the kids that ended up drifting away and no longer
move into the city.
But going back, that idea of the membership. So it is people who are supporting each other. There is that shared,
Well, and most of the time, geography is a factor. I think that's why Wendell Berry places so much emphasis upon place and location, that the membership, as he calls it existed in a place, and to become part of it, part of what was required was for you to move there. And then to leave the membership were these kids that left and went to the big city and never came back. And so they were no longer part of the membership. So I feel like there is a geographic component. I don't want to discount some of the other things that have been said about online relationships or correspondence type relationships or whatever. Those are still real. But I mean, the idea of membership was super powerful to me. I read Hannah Coulter right before my husband got really sick. This is 11 years ago or something now. But this part in here where he says, when people in networks suffer, they suffer alone. And about how in a community, you suffer with one another. And I remember experiencing that in a really powerful way. I mean, that was the first time I had really been through anything difficult as an adult, and it was community, but it wasn't even my church. It was my city. People I didn't even know showed up and mowed my lawn, or I would come home and there would be boxes of diapers on the front porch because I had an infant at the time. Goodness, I tear up even now thinking about it. I couldn't believe how many people were willing to catch us when we were falling. It was unbelievable. Part of it was, I don't know, it was this place. All the people lived within probably 5 miles of our house. And they just came over and showed up and did what needed to be done. And anyway, I don't know exactly where I'm going with that, but I guess I was thinking like that whole, for me, what's identifiable in network versus community was when something goes wrong, what happens? That to me is kind of a test of what we really belong to, if that makes sense.
So what about those schools where one of the kids gets sick and the entire school steps up?
I honestly was wondering some of that. And I wonder if there are some schools that have maintained some of this aspect of being, at the very least, an extension of the community. I don't know if I think it's quite as cut and dry as he says in here.
I think maybe it's easier rurally or not in big cities because and
wasn't he in New York?
Yeah, he was in New York. But even so, like, I think Portland schools have a 60% graduation rate. So we're not succeeding on the network plan. Right.
Yeah.
And not that I think, but I also think that's part of compulsory schooling's problem too. So,
for sure. Yeah.
And there are plenty of people who can come out of, school is not the place for them and they can do other things just fine.
Let's try to take this and apply this to like the homeschool community, the mothers group, the co-op that you belong to. All of us kind of have something along those lines in some form. Which is it for you? Do you have a homeschool network or do you have a homeschool community? And is there even an ideal? Because part of me is like, well, could you choose to be part of a network and would that be fine?
Well,
because you're finding your community elsewhere or something?
He even says in the chapter that it's not bad to be in networks. The problem is when you have only networks and when the networks are displacing the actual human relationships of family and then extended into community.
Yeah. I think not all networks are bad, but, then you have the vampire networks, which kind of, take it to the nth degree and then start sucking away the time that you have to spend with your family. So I think most of us would say as homeschoolers that even if we're part of a homeschooling network, as opposed to a homeschool community, it's not a vampire network for the most part. I think there probably are some vampire homeschool networks out there.
Even for my Plutarch class, I've tried to be really cautious. I give a little bit of homework and stuff, but to not encroach upon the family's time. Just because someone showed up to my class, does that really give me the right to dictate what they do outside of class? It's an interesting question as a teacher to try to balance that.
I think if the parents know that going into it.
Yeah.
And choose that.
True. Yeah. That's a good point.
Well, are networks more, should we look at them as a tool or a place for resources, whereas community is more about the intangible, right? The true goodness and beauty, right?
Well, and I think we have to I don't want to get away from Brandy's question, but I think we have to get into, so we've kind of scratched the surface of what he's talking about here, but then he gets into talk about the big problem with networks or the schools of the network, and that's how it's educating kids and what education is. So he says at the beginning of part 7, whatever an education is, it should make you a unique individual, not a conformist. It should furnish you with an original spirit with which to tackle the big challenges. It should allow you to find values which will be your roadmap through life. It should make you spiritually rich, a person who loves whatever you're doing, wherever you are, whomever you're with. It should teach you what is important, how to live and how to die. So he's saying that those big vampire networks don't do that.
That's kind of what I was getting at with this question is a real and true education our actual goal? Is that even possible inside of a network? Or are networks by definition so impersonal that it can't? Now, I'm not saying there's never a time for training. Even if we say that it's not really possible, doesn't mean that there wouldn't be some reason to do something or join a network or something. But I'm just saying, like, can we actually educate inside of a network at all?
Well, I think if you have something that is more like a network, then you have to be very careful to still guard your home time.
Yeah.
And be sure that the network isn't overwhelming and encroaching upon the actual home education that ought to be happening.
There are some people who send their kids to school. They go to public school their entire lives, and the kids come out, they're smart, they've learned a lot, they have great faith. They're all the things you would want a child to be. and it came out of public school. But I think when you dig down and start looking at how did this happen, it's not because of anything the public school did. It was everything that the family did.
Yeah. I would agree with that.
Now, there are going to be exceptions to this. There are going to be great kids who come out of public school who have a horrible family life. But I think for the most part, that's the exception and not the rule.
Well, I mean, you can look at an orphanage where all the kids are underfed and find the one kid that manages to grow on bread and water fare, right? And that doesn't make it an ideal, but it means that the humanity is quite remarkable at times.
Well, and I can't find where it is, but it was talking about how kids who come from a family with even just a taste of good family life. Do you guys know where that one is?
Oh, I know what you mean. Yeah.
That was what I was looking for, but I can't seem to find it.
But what you're saying is maybe they had a taste. Just like the kids thriving on bread and water. Maybe they had good prenatal nutrition.
Yeah, no, I don't know. I just was thinking that might be, it was going to what Pam was saying about coming from the family is the main.
To push that a little bit more where the family is the main thing. I mean, I would even say that that's why our co-op is very picky about who's in it. I mean, there's practical things like you need to have a child of a certain age, that kind of stuff. But for the most part, it's always been by invitation only. Also, we were like hand selecting families. And part of the reason for that was because we were building this community, if you will, around a shared philosophy and a shared faith. And when you hand select people, you kind of come into it knowing for sure that they're already embodied, like the family's already embodying those things. If you think of the family as a brick that's going into this building that's going to be the community, they're the right kind of brick. I'm just thinking about how, well, really it puts the school at a disadvantage too, right? Because they have to work with all the different kinds of families. They have to work with what they're given versus in a co-op, you have a lot more control over who's in it.
Yeah, this year we're opting out of the co-op just because of some of the requirements with this whole thing. So, but we are going to still get.
You mean like COVID?
COVID all of those things.
Okay.
And it's just, if we are just doing it on a purely cost benefit analysis, there's just too many downsides this year. My kids asked like, oh, well, as long as we can play in the gym, we'll go back to co-op. And I said, yeah, that's not an option. And they're like, oh, no, that's fine. We don't need to go. So my younger set. So we are not, but we are still getting together with one or two of the families at our house or their house for a few things. It is going to be smaller and less formal, but I think really good.
Sounds grassroots.
Yeah, it does.
This is kind of like the difference between a homeschool co-op and Mystie's elementary lessons.
Yeah,
true.
That is very much a community.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Because it's just me and my friend who are basically co-schooling. So we don't have policies and we don't do paperwork. I see the kids play, I see the kids even outside of the school hours, and I completely know what they are capable of and how to help them do the next thing that they can, to learn. And we just figure out through a back and forth what the next, how to configure the next school year. Can be a trick sometimes, but we accomplish that while taking a walk around the block.
That's awesome. So would you guys all say that ideally a homeschool co-op would be a community? Do you consider that the ideal? Even if the co-op is small, like two people, like Mystie and her friend?
Ideally, yes. But I think there's also a place for a network, as long as that network doesn't start encroaching upon the family, as long as it doesn't become a vampire network. I think a homeschooling network can meet the needs of some families some of the time.
For sure.
Yeah.
We actually have a local Facebook group that's called our, city name homeschool network. People get on there and they might talk, before this disease hit the world, they might talk about planning a field trip together so they could get a group buying discount, or setting up something at a park, or just even asking, do you know of a math tutor? My child needs a math tutor. I mean, all sorts of resources flying around in that group all the time. It's super useful. Not the same thing as a community, but also doesn't try to it doesn't make any demands of you.
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You can mute it and nobody cares. So there's a place for a network, but the ideal would be to have a homeschool community. is what I'm hearing you say.
Yeah. And so I think as homeschoolers, the question we're always asking ourselves is, if I'm taking part in something, have I let it become, is it a network that has started encroaching upon the thing that's the biggest benefit to us homeschooling in the first place, which is the time we spend together as a family, the control we have as a family to educate in the way we see fit and things like that.
Right.
You never want to sell your soul for community.
Mm-hmm.
How do you figure out how to make a homeschool community that is a true community and not just one of those vampire networks? How do you know the difference, and how do you strive for the right thing?
Be willing to walk away. Sometimes I think there's a lot of pressure to come back every year, right? Your kids have made friends and there's good things about it, but it was a hard decision to walk away this year. But ultimately, I know it's the right thing for our family because of COVID, because of lockdown. Ultimately, we've been forced to face some of our outside commitments and networks and communities and really evaluate if they are indeed meeting the needs and or if they're serving us and we're able to serve in a capacity that is beneficial to ourselves and others. I think too, it has made me realize how important church community is, and being together with those members of my church and seeing those people every week too, and staying connected because they are ultimately about the family. And even good homeschool co-ops sometimes can it's not just about the family, it's about education and other things. So
when you said be willing to walk away, at first I kind of cringed because I thought, well, can you really walk away from true community? Like, is that even right or whatever? But then I found a quote near the end of this essay where he said, the natural solution to learning to live together in a community is first to learn to live apart as individuals and families.
Learn to live apart.
Yeah, I think it's seeing that hierarchy and making decisions in light of our most important community is our family community. So anything that threatens that needs to go. We can walk away from that or reassess and adjust. And then second needs to be the church community and being part of a body there. And so anything that takes so much time that we don't have time for a church family, even though that might not seem efficient or in line with, but the only goal that I care about is the education of my child. Like, well, actually being a part of a church family, they might not learn literature and math, but they're learning about
the truly important things.
Yeah, a whole orb life. Like what actually matters.
Well, that's that quote. I can't remember who read that earlier, but that quote at the beginning of part 7, where he says that whatever an education is, it should make you spiritually rich, a person who loves whatever you're doing, wherever you are, whomever you're with. It should teach you what's important, how to live and how to die.
Right.
And
that's church.
Church is the ideal place to learn all that.
Yeah.
So any homeschool community should either flow out of those relationships and kind of be wrapped up in that community, like you're in churches or sister churches together as well, or not disrupt that community. We shouldn't treat a homeschool co-op like a replacement community for church.
Yeah.
If there's one thing I could think of that we didn't quite touch on, but I think is kind of pertinent to some of this, is this idea that the community is made up of individuals while the network is very conformist in nature. So it seems like a regular network, you're just organized around the activity, like you said earlier, Mystie. So you've got everybody here plays chess or golf or whatever it is. You're conforming by choice because you're organized around a single activity. But then there's the vampire network where we see like the school trying to mass produce a certain kind of person, and kids that don't fit into that little box don't necessarily do so well. But I found it interesting in this that you had this emphasis on free time and that a community actually gives scope to personality instead of limiting it. I'm wondering about in homeschool communities, if giving scope to individuality, to individual initiative is another way to strive for the ideal, that we're not trying to just like fit all the kids into this little classical box or Charlotte Mason box or whatever we can get into our heads. You know what I mean? But like if we go back to the bigger principles of the good, the true, and the beautiful, and developing their personhood and disciplining the will and all that kind of stuff, I think it gives room for what they say? In the community, you're going to see the good, the bad, the ugly, right? Because it's the whole person. Thinking of the whole person first also allows for the homeschool community to remain a community and not become some sort of systemized network.
Yeah, I think that's a great point.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody have a great ending quote for us from this essay? Something you wish we'd read?
Part 5. An important difference between communities and institutions is that communities have natural limits. They stop growing or they die. There is a good reason for this. In the best communities, everyone is a special person who sooner or later impinges on everyone else's consciousness.
Yeah.
The effects of this constant attention will make all, rich or poor, feel important because the only way importance is perceived is by having other folks pay attention to you. You can buy attention, of course, but it is not the same thing. Pseudo-community life, where you live around others without noticing them, is where you are constantly being menaced in some way by strangers and you find offensive, is exactly the opposite. In a pseudo-community life, you are anonymous for the most part. Whereas, like you were saying, Brandy, that scope for the individual personhood is noticed.
There's also a great quote that's super applicable there on page 53 on mine, which I think, Brandy, I have the same as you. It says, a real community is, of course, a collection of real families who themselves function in this participatory way.
You know, this is sort of an aside, but it actually kind of reminds me of how people can actually join a church in this periphery sort of way and not have a real community.
Yeah.
I have known people who flirted on the edges of some mega church because it allowed them to go to church without actually being part of a church, really.
Mm-hmm.
So it's probably a good reminder with this kind of thing that participation is part of being in a community. So whether it's a church or a homeschool community, always hanging back and never allowing yourself to know or be known, or even allowing yourself to know but not be known.
Well, and if for some reason we miss church, I get texts and phone calls like, hey, where were you guys? Did you guys go somewhere? I mean, that's, the community
watching out,
making sure. Yeah. Looking out for you. And my church denomination talks about, well, there's a certain size that's about right for a community. And it's this many members because we really can be up in each other's business at this size. In a loving and kind way.
It's really funny. Oh, that's true.
I also liked where he pointed out that isolation of young and old is not okay.
Yeah.
So he says, the griefs that arise from the disconnection of the generations have no synthetic remedy, and no vibrant, satisfying communities can come into being where young and old are locked away.
Okay, so let's talk about how COVID is a problem. Because what are we doing? We're locking away the young and old.
Yes.
How we think this is not long-term destructive to culture, I just don't even know. 6 months is a long time to a small child.
6 months is a long time to me.
Yep. Amen.
Or grandparents not giving their grandkids hugs.
Yeah. 6 months is a long time for a grandparent.
Yes. Oh, wow. And we've buried someone and had to wait months to do it because of this. And we know a guy at our church that still hasn't had a memorial service. His wife died in the spring. Even just, people who have delayed weddings.
Yeah.
People who have had babies but couldn't have any help or felt like they couldn't have any help. The breakdown of culture and
the breakdown of community.
Community, exactly. And the regular community. Well, I'll tell you, my 92-year-old grandma, she, stayed home at first and we did whatever she told us to do. And so at Easter, we drove by her house and, waved from the car and this kind of stuff. And beginning of summer, she told me, if she dies, but she's done. Please come over. Don't wear a mask, hug her, eat her food and swim in her pool. And she's just like, this isn't the way she wants to live. And I was just, at 92 years old, I am more than happy to accommodate that if that is what you want.
Yeah, there's a big difference between living and being alive.
Amen.
Mm.
Yeah, I think we have to be careful not to let fear of one thing. And I believe this is a very real virus and it is dangerous. But we can't let fear of one thing kill community.
Right.
That's not the altar we worship at, our own personal health. So anyway, that was kind of an aside, but I have some feels about this, guys.
Soapbox moment. Soapbox moment.
Really, really. Oh, anyway, thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Brandy. This was great.
Thanks.
It was fun.
That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening and being a part of the sisterhood of the podcast. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss our upcoming episodes. Every episode has a Scholé sheet, and this episode is no exception. At Scholé Sisters, we want to be people who apply what we learn rather than just listening and forgetting. Scholé sheets are individual journal pages that help you apply the ideas from the episode. Download your Scholé sheet for free from our show notes at scholesisters.com/SS77. Our annual fall online local retreats are something we look forward to every year, and this year is no exception. As I mentioned earlier, registration is now open over at scholesisters.com/love. If you want to host a local retreat event, just fill out the form at scholesisters.com/local and we'll help you pull it off. In our next episode, Mystie and I will be having a fabulous conversation with the one and only Susan Wise Bauer. It was a joy to talk with her about giving ourselves the classical educations we never received. You're going to love it. Until then, we want to remind you once again that homeschooling is a marathon you needn't run alone, so open up your eyes and look around you. Find your sisters.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. You sound like someone with a microphone.
I do have a microphone.
I'm having problems. I think I need to tighten a screw or something on my
So you have a screw loose.
I have a screw loose. Exactly.
But I'm getting shouted at from my children because they can't seem to remember that I am online. So, excuse me. I'm being mommed.